the Kahanists have had Democrats in their thrall for decades now. And the way to understand the worst of them is probably to look at who were the biggest proponents of the Kahanism. Now, of course, Heiken himself is probably the most famous of them. You know, every year he goes and honors Kahana at memorial services for Kahana and his son, his successor. But, you know, he was doing this from the very beginning, from when Kahana was first assassinated in New York City in 1990. And here at the funeral services at, as I mentioned, the Young Israel Synagogue of Ocean Parkway, at the funeral ceremony, let's look at who were the top rabbis who venerated him, who praised him, who lifted him up, who preached Kahanism from the pulpit. Were they randoms? Were they randos who you'd never hear of again and who don't have any political power? No. They are the most powerful rabbis in New York. At his funeral ceremony, from the pulpit, he said, God spoke to Kahana clearly. Time has proven his wisdom. And who was that? None other than Rabbi Moshe Tendler. Not just any old rabbi, but the dean of Yeshiva University Theological Seminary. And over the years, what's he done? Every single political development, as Israel is turned even further and further to the far right, he has been its most ardent supporter. In 2010, when hundreds of Israeli rabbis, chief rabbis, paid by my tax money, big salaries, okay, chief rabbis of Israeli cities all around the country sign an edict, a religious edict, saying that Jews are not permitted to sell or even rent properties to non-Jews, to Palestinians or other non-Jews. Look, that's straight racism, and it's obvious to anyone who hears it. And so at this point, you know, American rabbis across the board expunge this idea and criticize it harshly. But Tendler stood up and spoke in support of this rabbi's letter, saying, it's part of a concern, and I believe a rightful one. There's a war going on, and we're trying our best to maintain normalcy by refusing to sell or even rent apartments to non-Jews. Preaching this from the streets of New York City, the most multicultural city in the world, the most cosmopolitan city in the world. Until Tendler stepped to the mic, Orthodox Jews weren't supporting the Aqsa destructionist movement. Across the board, every Orthodox rabbi worth his salt would tell you, Jews are not supposed to go up to Haram al-Sharif. That is only for a messianic era. We are in an impure state. It is a Muslim shrine. It's going to stay that way until God comes down and decides otherwise. Until then, Jews don't go up. But not Tendler. Tendler was the first rabbi who actively spoke out in support of the Al-Aqsa destructionist movement, the Jewish Templar movement, the modern Jewish Templars who want to take over the site, demolish the mosques, and turn it into a Jewish temple / abattoir. Tendler took a tour of the site, and with the leader of the destructionist movement, Israel Ariel, and since that time, because he was the first person to step out and support, others joined in his wake. And now we have a massive movement. Now it's actually become a mass movement. Now there's still not a majority, but scarily and sickeningly, this has become a more mainstream movement in Israeli society. And it's thanks to people like Tendler. And Tendler wasn't beyond the pale. That's the crazy part. He wasn't someone that you wouldn't want anything to do with. He had the Democratic Party by the balls. Kenneth Gribbetz, again, Brooklyn DA, or Rockland County DA, New York area DA, Metropolitan New York area District Attorney. According to New York Magazine, going back to the 1970s, that Tendler was Gribbetz's mentor. He was his secret weapon. He was the guardian of his political fortune. And he delivered the votes for Gribbetz. As Heiken explained, because his community voted as he chose and as he instructed them, he funneled the votes to Gribbets, and Gribbets did his bidding, the most racist rabbi in New York City. Now, it wasn't only Tendler, okay, in the first few years, the funeral took place at Young Israel of Ocean Parkway, and the first few memorial ceremonies took place at that synagogue as well. But who was the rabbi of that synagogue? Tendler was the guest speaker. The chief rabbi of that synagogue was Rabbi Herbert Baumser. Again, not a marginal figure, not someone no one wants anything to do with. We're talking about someone who was, again, not low on the totem pole, but the dean of Yeshiva University, the flagship educational institution of Orthodox Judaism in America. And this dean of Yeshiva University hosted Kahana when he was alive, allowed him to speak to his students at the yeshiva, at the synagogue, held memorial services, and Herbert Baumser held in his thrall Charles Hines, Brooklyn DA from the Democratic Party. All these are Democratic Party politicians. And how did that manifest? What was the results of Baumser's stranglehold on Democratic Party politics? Sickeningly, it meant that according to the New York Times, who reported on it, it made it harder to curb sexual abuse because these rabbis would create a smokescreen and allow these men who had committed horrific crimes against children in the community and children outside the community and who were charged with horrific crimes to escape to Israel so they wouldn't face any retribution. And when it came to pass, and a man that Herbert Baumser had hired to teach children was charged with the rape, and experts say the number of children he raped ranged between 100 and 400 kids. But what did Baumser have to say? He said, if he has managed to get to Israel and he's protected by the law there, then leave it alone. This is what he used his political power for. This is what the Democratic Party in New York City is responsible for. This is the legacy of the Kahana movement in New York. Now, Herbert Baumser got old. He's since died. He passed on to his assistant, to his next in line, to the person with whom he led the Vada Rabbanim of Flatbush. And from then on, from the late 1990s into the 2000s, we have every year the Kahana memorial services now shifting venues to this synagogue just down the street, walking distance, also in that same area of Brooklyn, New York, called the Pri Etz Chaim Synagogue. Would you believe it? Chuck Schumer found this synagogue so pivotal that he actually brought the American House of Representatives committee to have a meeting at this synagogue. It's the only time in American history that any synagogue, or perhaps any house of worship even, but certainly any Jewish house of worship, was hosting a meeting, an official meeting of an American congressional delegation of a House of Representatives committee. Hosted it in this synagogue that provided a platform year after year after year for Kahanist ideology and Kahanist supporters to preach their hatred. From the bima, from the pulpit, they preached Kahanism every year in, year out. Rabbi Melvinberg was the rabbi there. And when he stood up at the Kahana memorials, he said that Kahana stood for what was correct. We should have agreed with them. And talking to the followers of Kahana who had organized that memorial in his synagogue, he said, it's not the congregation allowing you to come here. You are allowing us to do something. You are doing a favor to us by allowing us to honor this ultra-racist Meir Kahana. Now, Berg, for his efforts, for his dedication to the Kahana movement and his racist ideology, the Kahana movement decided to honor him and to grant him an award. So he's now an award-winning rabbi. the award he won was the Rabbi Kahana Memorial Fund Award of Courage and Integrity. Wow, well, that should have put him in a category beyond the pale. But not for the Democratic Party of New York, who felt that he also deserved to receive an award from the Democratic Party for being, the leader of an important community, and so they wanted to honor him. So the Democratic Party, the local Democratic Party officials actually granted him an award, this sickening preacher who supported Kahana in every which way as long as he was alive, and created a platform where his followers could incite genocide. And if you think I'm exaggerating, let's look at what was said besides the rabbi himself, what Kahana's followers said from that podium once he stepped off the stage. Of course, we had that sickening successor to Kahana, the Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg, who published the King's Torah, calling for the murder of non-Jewish babies. But we also had the head of the publishing company, Ginsburg Publishing Company, that published these sickening texts, talking about Shmuel Sackett, another New York-born Jew who followed Kahana to Israel. And when he took the podium at Bli Etz Chaim synagogue, he told those assembled, "I am a student of Rabbi Meir Kahana. I was, I am, I always will be, and proud of it. My children are being trained in the way of our teacher and rabbi." And then he's instructing them, what does that mean? Well, what is Kahanism? Let there be no mistakes. I'll break it down for you. In your business and in your personal life, don't hire any Arabs whatsoever. Not to paint your house, not to fix your toilet, not to fix your electricity, not to be a worker or a mover. If you really love Jews, then you drive out the Arabs. And that's not it. It doesn't end there. For those who are counting there. No, after we drive out the Arabs, we drive out the Armenians. And we drive out the Christians. Make no mistake, they are absolutely serious when they say they want to ethnically cleanse the country by force. They are not joking.